When we think about these struggles between parent and child, we see conflict and there's often pain points. But I think the positive is we can see that these conflicts and pain points are actually raising and training our kids to handle with dual or tri-cultural narratives. There's been a long-running joke, right, that the senior pastor just wants to find a youth pastor to babysit the kids while they do the real ministry to the adults. They actually have to be the best theologian at the church. They have to be the best missiologist or missionary at the church. They have to be the best apologetic worker at the church, apologist. The things that you're going to see as a senior leader in your adult congregation in 5 to 10 years are the things your youth pastor is already seeing right now. So your greatest asset to your future ministry in your church is actually your youth pastor. And so the way I think about it is youth ministry is actually the churches are struggling on the whole to find youth pastors. There's a lot of reasons why that is, though we may not reap those rewards, though our time with the youth may be fraught with struggle and pain. We have my name's Clark. I was born and raised in San Francisco. I did my Master of Divinity at Talbot School of Theology here in Southern California and just completed my Doctorate of Missiology at Southern Seminary. But I'm an associate pastor at First Baptist Church in San Francisco. Been born and raised in San Francisco, so I've been doing ministry there for the last 12 years or so. And before going to, so this is a multi-ethnic church in the heart of the city. Before that, I was at a variety of Asian churches down here in SoCal, Korean immigrant, Korean American, and then in San Francisco at a Chinese immigrant, Chinese American church. So yeah, just serving in a multi-ethnic setting now, overseeing discipleship at our church, youth and families, small groups ministry, and adult discipleship. And then I work with Rooted on the side. So I'm still very much involved in youth and family ministry, and just see my role with Rooted and with the church is really just I guess equipping families, especially, but also teens, but especially families, to grow in their discipleship of their teens to set up the next generation for healthy and sustainable growth, but also just whatever God has for them in the next generation.
What encouragement would you give to immigrant parents raising teenagers in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly where things are right now with immigrant church and trends. I think, the immigrant shifts are changing a little bit, the immigrant waves. But I know from my experience in the immigrant church, the biggest contention with their kids has always been the cultural gap, whether that's generational, language, but there's a huge cultural gap always between the immigrant parent and the American born and raised kids. And what I would often run into with those parents, or I guess deal with those parents, is they would lament the fact that their kids are growing up in a culture so different from them. So the understanding was hard across that generational and culture gap, but there was also a sense of, how do they raise their kid when they don't fully understand them? How do they raise their kid in a way where they hold on to their cultural heritage? And I think to those parents, I would say, as hard as that is, the time taken to cross that cultural gap with their kid is one that gives their kids a huge advantage when it comes to navigating life in our current world, but I think also a spiritual advantage. And I guess what I mean by that is, as we're looking at trends right now, demographically and even spiritually with Christianity in America, there's a huge shift that's been happening over the last 5 to 10 years where teens today, young people today, are no longer in a white majority culture. Gen Z, the generation born from 1995 to 2012, however you shake that down, is about 49% white. And so they're now minority population. Along with that, Christianity's been in the decline for a while. The fastest declining segment of the church on American soil is the white evangelical church, whereas the fastest growing segment of Christianity are the Protestant churches of color. And there's this book written in 2014 by Soong-Chan Rah called The Next Evangelicalism, where he basically says the future of the American church is going to look non-white, non-Christendom entrenched, basically not just assuming Christian subculture. And he gives this great call to the minority Christians in his book, or in America through his book, to rise up to this challenge or this call to basically lead the charge of Christianity in America in the next generation. And And towards the end of his book, I love what he says. He says the third culture kids, the ones who have had to learn how to straddle the American majority culture and their home culture, but yet don't quite feel at home in either. Those are the ones that are best poised to handle the complexities of culture today. They're also the ones that are best poised to discern what does faith look like in this iteration and generation. And so for the parents of those kids, when we think about these struggles between parent and child, we see conflict and there's often pain points. But I think the positive is we can see that these conflicts and pain points are actually raising and training our kids to handle with dual or tri-cultural narratives. And so for the immigrant parent, or honestly, even the Asian American parent that's maybe a second gen raising a third gen, I think it's a good thing to feel that sense of lament or longing for our kids to want to hold on to their home culture, not fully understanding what it's like for them in this host culture. And yet the more that we can do whatever we can as parents, or you can as parents, to impart that culture to them, you can really lift them up and set them up to be the next generation of businessmen, professionals, leaders, and Christian leaders that can, I think, bring about, maybe in the negative, a reckoning, but I think in the positive, a revival in American Christian soil. And so there's a lot of hope, and I think there's a lot of, for me, excitement when I look at the Asian and Asian immigrant church, and especially the parents and families, of how much hope and excitement they can have for their next generation, even if it doesn't look the way they may want it to look, but imparting, passing the baton on, so to speak, to their kids as they grow into adulthood.
What is one thing you wish church leaders knew about the challenges youth pastors face?
Yeah, if I'm thinking about senior leaders, like senior pastors, elders, deacons, basically people that are not with youth, there's been a long-running joke, right, that the senior pastor just wants to find a youth pastor to babysit the kids while they do the real ministry to the adults. I think thankfully that narrative's starting to change. But I do think a lot of, maybe more so with Asian churches too, it feels like the senior pastors or senior leaders can still almost think of the youth ministry as like the JV ministry. They are doing a little bit lesser of the work while the senior leaders, elders, and pastors are ministering, really doing the real work of ministry, or a greater work of ministry. And I think what I would tell senior leaders is actually to think about it the other way around. If you think about the challenges youth pastors face today, they are facing some of the fastest demographic shifts we've ever seen, some of the fastest cultural shifts and trends. And so youth pastors and people that work with youth are often, while they're on the front lines or on the ground working with youth, figuring things out as they're ministering in the trenches. By the time senior leaders get the next book on Gen Z, let's say, or the next cultural trends that have come about, that's research that's 3 to 5 years old at the minimum. That is the reality that youth pastors have already been facing for the last 3 to 5 years. And so they're already working in a generation, with a generation far less equipped than they would love to be, and yet they're figuring it out on the front lines. And so the way I think about it is youth ministry is actually it's the tip of the spear of ministry and mission in America. Youth pastors have to deal with some of the most difficult theological questions because of the questions kids are asking. They have to deal with some of the most difficult cultural questions, especially when it comes to sexuality and gender issues. They have to deal with some of the most difficult political questions because they're facing questions of kids as they're growing up under the oversight of their parents that are maybe already kind of entrenched in their political views. And so young people today have a far more complex reality that youth pastors and leaders need to deal with and figure out how to address. And so what I often think about with the youth pastor is they actually have to be the best theologian at the church. They have to be the best missiologist or missionary at the church. They have to be the best apologetic worker at the church, apologist. And I think to corroborate that with something that I've seen in more missiological research, Stefan Paz, he's a Dutch missiologist, he works out of Amsterdam. He wrote this book in 2019 called Pilgrims and Priests, where he essentially says that the most predictive quality for someone to come to faith in adulthood is whether they had any childhood experience in the church. And he runs all these different tests and research, does a lot of field research, and basically says the highest rate of new believer growth is from that demographic that has experience in the church, whether that was infrequent or not. And so one of the conclusions he makes is that actually the best way to project future or long-term evangelistic growth or even revival is in how we deal with the next generation today. So ministering to children and youth right now is the greatest means of reaching the next generation and bringing about even revival 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And so for the senior leaders, I would just say maybe think about it as your youth pastors, they're not the JV person on the side that you relegate to like the babysitting room in the church. Think of them as the tip of the spear, the most vital ministry, the most vital people, even the parents in your church. Those are the most vital people you need to equip for the future ministry and mission, both of your local church, but also the church as a whole, and to really uplift and value them and equip them. Help them get equipped, fund any training they need, help them get the books they need, and then learn from them, to be honest. I know that's hard for senior leaders to do, especially in Asian churches. We often think the elders are the most wise, and they definitely have more learning, but the things that you're gonna see as a senior leader in your adult congregation in 5 to 10 years are the things your youth pastor is already seeing right now. So your greatest asset to your future ministry in your church is actually your youth pastor, your parents, and those working with the youth in the church. So whatever you can do to encourage them and utilize them, I think there's a lot of partnership that can be done through that relationship.
What encouragement or advice would you give to those working with youth?
I think it'd probably be honestly just the simple thing that I talked about in my workshop here at this one-day training is that just stay faithful and play the long game of youth ministry. I remember my very first youth ministry was with 12 students in a small Korean immigrant church. All my friends would say like, oh, that's so sweet. You have 12 students like Jesus and his 12 disciples. And I'd always think like, oh yeah, I guess that is, but if I have 12 students, who's my Judas? But then even it felt more like I had 11 Judases and one disciple at sometimes. And so it was just really hard to see the point of what I was doing. And I think those of us working with youth, and maybe even at a higher rate, those working in immigrant churches, we can sometimes question, is there any value in what we're doing? Often we look down upon from our peers because we're not in the varsity ministry. We can kind of look down on from those that are older in ministry because we're not working with adults. And so there's a big temptation to question our value, our worth, our calling. But I think as the same as I would encourage senior leaders, how they view youth ministers and youth pastors, or even those working with youth and even parents, but rather to see the great value and dignity they have because of how necessary and urgent the need for working with youth is today. I think it's unfortunate that churches are struggling on the whole to find youth pastors. There's a lot of reasons why that is, but I think probably the most basic fundamental one is people are graduating out of seminary less, so less people going into ministry. And the few that are, they're looking for immediately for ministry opportunities with adults. They kind of think a little bit more lowly of youth ministry. I've been working in youth ministry and with students for a combined total of about 20 years, 15 to 20 years now. And one of the reasons I'm still involved with it is because I don't see youth ministry as the lesser or JV ministry. I really think if we want to see the next generation come to faith in Christ, and we want to see any sort of revival that we talk about a lot on American soil with the decline of Christianity, we're sowing the seeds in the present for the gospel, for the future reaping of the harvest of the gospel. By sowing these seeds of the gospel right now, we may not see fruit for 10, 20, 30 years. But come in that time, 10, 20, 30 years from now, when these students are in their adulthood, as Stephen Paz says, the greatest indicator or factor for adult conversion is childhood involvement in the church, then we are giving them, even in a small part, the seed of the gospel, as John Livingston Nevius, my missionary hero, says, will not vanish even well into their adult years. And though we may not reap those rewards, though our time with the youth may be fraught with struggle and pain, we have the Genesis work, the initial tilling soil, planting seeds for future revival. And just what an amazing thought that is, to think that we may not get any of the credits, those working with youth, for future revival. The people on the front lines at the time, the Spurgeons, the Billy Grahams, so on and so forth, they get all the credits. But think about all those youth pastors that worked 10, 20 years before Spurgeon came on the scene, before Billy Graham was on the scene. Those were the ones that planted the seeds for the revival that these key figureheads got to experience. And so I think youth pastors have one of the greatest privileges, those working with youth, and I think parents raising kids and teens faithfully, to plant these seeds for future revival and growth that is not going to come by the white majority church in America. It's going to come through the minority church. And I really believe that the Asian church has so much more to offer. In fact, the Asian church is needed when it comes to this future of the church in America. And so I hope those working with youth in the immediate, as much as it's hard, would feel some hope and excitement that God has dignified and placed you in a time, placed you in a position for this time for future reaping of the harvest that God is going to do through the power of His Spirit.
Sola Network exists to influence the emerging generation of Asian Americans and those who lead them with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Find our articles, book reviews, podcasts, and more at sola.network. If you would like to partner with Sola Network through collaboration, networking, volunteering, or giving, please contact us through the website.